Alright, we got some more random jobs and stories here to talk about. Another Monday is here. So Mike Ponder put a post on there that said, Monday, Monday, Monday. You go, Mike. Anyway, this is a story about an Acura Vigor. This guy that I knew really well back in the day, he was a tremendous advocate of anything that was Asian, particularly Hondas. You know, an Acura is kind of like the Cadillac version of Honda. And he was telling me that he was looking around for another car for his wife, and he found this Acura Vigor, but it only had 130,000 miles on it, and this has been several years ago. And it had belonged to some mom and pop, and you know, it was like it was a brand new car. You know, when you drove it, it drove and rode good. It felt real heavy on the road, and it was quiet and all that kind of thing, you know. And I think he paid $4,400 for it, and he was really happy to get it. Well, the first time he drove it to the big town up the road, which was basically he drove it to Birmingham, I think. And the first time he drove it up there, he got up there and part of the way back, and the engine starved for oil and locked up. And so he had to have another engine put in it. It was like $1,700 for an engine. Now, typically what happens on a mom and pop car is they drive it little short drives, or they don't let it warm up, and it gets all sludged up on the inside, and sludge just gets caked everywhere. And he drove it far enough to heat all that sludge up, and the sludge ran off like heavy black whatever sludge syrup and into the bottom of the crankcase, and it clogged the screen and starved it for oil and just fried the engine. And so he paid $4,400 for it, and he had to put another $1,700 in it. And they drove it for a while after that, after he got the engine put in it. And then the transmission quit pulling. And so he wanted to know if we would look at that. So he brought it down, and you know, he was somehow or another we qualified him for work at the college. And so this thing right here has got it's basically got an engine that's in a north-south orientation. In other words, the radiator, the engine is, the front of the engine's at the radiator, the back of it is at the bulkhead. And it's got a very strange transmission. You might notice this is the transmission output shaft. It doesn't have a drive shaft going to a rear axle. The transmission is geared so that it comes and it goes right into this differential right here. And the problem with it was that the splines on that transmission output shaft were stripped, and also the ones in here were stripped. So it wiped out these splines, and it wiped out those splines. And so we went ahead, and that's kind of what you're looking at there. It destroyed those splines, and so basically what we wanted to do was we had to replace the differential, and we also had to replace the transaxle itself, if you could call it a transaxle. It's basically a transmission because it doesn't have a differential built in there with it. But whenever whoever put the engine in it didn't put grease, you're supposed to put grease all over those splines up in there so that it won't wear out this way. And see, they drove it for a while before it wiped out those splines and all that. So anyway, that was the story on that one. Now this little picture right here, you can tell this is an epic disaster. And if you see this Bronco right here, this was a trainer vehicle, and this was a rusty old piece of junk Honda that probably wasn't worth $100 sitting beside the road with a for sale sign on it. The rotors had worn away so badly on this, there was nothing left of them, and so it had to have rotors and calipers and all that kind of stuff. And the woman that owned the car basically was just getting it fixed so she could give it away or something, I don't know. But what happened was there was a worksheet that I had given out the previous day, and it had to do with the stop lamp switch and whatnot. And so the student that was working on this one, he basically pulled the stop lamp switch off, and on these Fords, you know what that means. You take the stop lamp switch off, you've basically disconnected the push rod from the brake pedal. The pin had to come out, and so brake pedal's just in there swinging. And it came time to go home, and he just said, well, I'm just going into the house. So he just left that vehicle like that, disabled, and I didn't even realize. It was sitting there, the door, I mean, you couldn't tell there was anything wrong with it just looking at it. And I reached in there just reached through the window and fired it up and had it sitting there idling. And one of the dual enrollment high school students wanted to back it out of the shop for whatever reason. And so these other guys were over here getting ready to do this brake work on this old Honda. And so this guy he was a fairly inexperienced driver, and I should have known better anyway. But he, instead of putting that Bronco in reverse, which wouldn't have been near as much of a problem, he managed somehow to get it into drive. And then when it started moving forward, the brake pedal was swinging and he couldn't stop it. And it pushed a workbench out of the way and knocked that car off the lift, just like you see right there. I was sitting in a yellow Chrysler Crossfire watching all of this happen. And it was an epic disaster. After we untangled all this hopscotch, the president of the college said, well, we need to get this Honda car fixed. There wasn't very much damage, just a little bit of damage to one of the fenders or something. Surprisingly, it did more damage to the Bronco when the thing bent the hood in than it did the Honda car. And so I said, okay, I'll tell her about that. So I called her up and told her we were going to straighten that fender out. She said, I don't care about a dented fender. I couldn't care less about that. If the brakes are fixed and the car will drive, I don't really give a rip. But the president of the college says, no, we're going to fix this and all. Because like I say, the car was just a rusted out piece of junk anyway. Anyway, that could have been a lot worse than it was. Nobody got hurt, and I'm really thankful for that. But I basically I went through all of this teaching as a result of this. That same student managed to take the Sonata trainer car, and he put it outside with the windows down, and he put the key in his pocket and went home with it. The only key I had to that car, which had been donated to me by the assembly plant in Montgomery. And it rained, and I couldn't roll the windows up, couldn't move the car. And so anyway, whenever he came back with the keys, he had this silly grin on his face. And he was somebody that had a tendency to ruin things anyway. He drove a Power Stroke diesel with a 6-liter, and it had the surge tank, the pressure tank on the coolant system was cracked. And I told him, I says, you need to replace this surge tank. They've got one at the parts store. I've already called them. It's $48. We need to put this surge tank on here because you're going to lose coolant and you're going to damage the engine. No, I don't want to get off that much money today. I'll just keep water in it. Well, the end of that story was about 4 or 5 days later, he got it hot and he burned up that 6-liter diesel and basically bricked the truck. I don't know what they ever did with it, but I know they didn't put an engine in it. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff that guy did. He was a disaster with a capital D. I even threatened to get him a hat to wear that said Ruination. And he said, no, don't do that to me. But anyhow, this was the kind of stuff I had to deal with all the time when I had that guy in there. All right, so let's look at this one here. This is a picture I got off the internet. Let's talk about how this happened. If you know anything about, if you've ever taught a bunch of people how to raise vehicles up on a lift, and they get accustomed to raising up these unibody cars by putting the lift pads under the places where the floor jack, where the jack goes for changing a spare, the little notches in the pinch weld. They get used to that, and they've jacked a bunch of those cars up, but they've never been explained, they've never had frames explained to them. Then they're subject to take the lift pads and put them under the body on a vehicle like this one here, so that whenever you raise it up, the frame and everything is hanging on those rubber mounts and their bolts. And I would say, just looking at this, that whoever raised this vehicle up, raised it up by putting the pads under the body of the truck, and the frame fell out from under there, and caused all this big bunch of nonsense. Now that's me looking at it from what I know. I actually would have to really watch the newer students really close to make sure they knew how to put a lift under a vehicle. I had one of those books over there that would tell you on each vehicle where to put the lifts, but you can figure it out. If it's got a ladder frame, you put it under the frame. You don't put it under the body on one of those. but they were just really confused about that, you know. And so somebody that doesn't really know how a vehicle is constructed probably shouldn't be lifting it up. But somebody made a mistake on this one. Probably, that's me just assessing it from what I see. I don't know what the actual story was, but that's what I'd say happened. Now here's another failure. The problem with this one here was somebody put a lift in without checking. They either put bolts that were too small to bolt the lift down, or they bolted it down to concrete that wasn't thick enough. I knew this one guy that put in lifts all the time, and he would check the depth of the concrete before he ever installed a lift. And if he found out some of these shops, he said some of these dealerships that are kind of new will have concrete in places that's only 2 inches thick. And he says what he would always have to do is cut that out, dig out a bunch of dirt and pour some really thick concrete in there, put rebar in it and all that, before he ever put the lift in there. Because if you don't, you're going to wind up with a situation like this where the lift comes loose from the floor because of the car getting slightly out of balance. Anyway, that's another picture I got off the internet. I didn't take that one. Now the one that I showed you previously, I did take that one there. I mean, that happened in the shop, you know, at the college. That's the only accident like that we ever had. This was my 69 LTD. That's me sitting in my 69 LTD. That's my mom and dad. This was when I was still in high school. And it was a beautiful car. I always loved that car. Paid $950 for it. And I drove it. It had a 390 in it. And it would get 18 miles to the gallon. You know, automatic transmission, power steering, all that kind of thing. First vehicle I'd ever owned had air conditioning on it. But that was a fine automobile. And I sold it for, I traded a guy that car and $600 for some photography equipment, because I was kind of into photography at the time as a sort of a hobby and all that. Alright, so in this 69 LTD, the radio was over on that side of the steering wheel, and I put an FM converter on there because they just had an AM radio, because a lot of vehicles back in those days came with AM radios. And remember, this car was built in 69. Well, that FM converter was a really cool little item that you mounted under the dash, and you run the antenna wire from the antenna into this, and then you run the antenna from this into the radio antenna. In other words, radio antenna port. Okay, so then you had an FM radio. You'd actually tune this to a particular frequency, and this would play through the AM radio through your regular speakers. And so this was my radio, it was my music. Whenever we rode in everybody else's car, I had a tendency to sort of enjoy country music, and sometimes I'd listen to some easy listening stuff. Well, these other guys that I hung out with liked to listen to this headbanging stuff and that kind of stuff. And so one day I was with a couple of them, and we were riding along, and I was playing the music that I like to hear, because this was my car and my radio, and they couldn't get to the radio because it was on the other side of the steering wheel, and that really frustrated them. And so I was playing my music, and they kept fussing and fussing and fussing, and finally I turned the radio off. Oh boy, they really did go into orbit then, you know. And so we stopped at McDonald's, and I said, and they were on my case about everything because they were mad because I turned off the music. You know, why in the world somebody gets so mad about that? And so they kept on, and I said, you guys are going to get in trouble and have to walk home if you keep, you know, giving me a hard time. And so they kept giving me a hard time, and one of them said something I didn't like when we were getting back in the car, and I didn't unlock the car door, and I backed out and left them up there, and they had to find a ride home with somebody else. But the thing about it is, you know, you basically have to earn the respect of your peers. You know, if you roll over every time they fuss at you about something, here you are, you know, you're going to wind up getting pushed around your whole life and all. This was my 67 Chrysler New Yorker. What happened with this, my dad bought my mother a 73 Imperial to replace her 66 New Yorker, which was a yellow one. And that 66 Chrysler was probably one of the best cars we ever owned when I was growing up. And it had a 440 in it and a 727 torque flat, just like this one. Well, this woman had a filling station mechanic. She pulled in there somewhere to get some gas. And I mentioned this car one time before, but I don't think I ever showed you guys a picture of it. And somebody poured STP gas treatment in it, and it locked the engine up. Or it actually made it turn really, really slow. It's like it washed all the oil off the wrist pins or something. But anyhow, when she drove it home after that guy put STP gas treatment in the oil, it never started again for her. And so my dad sold her the yellow car for $300 in her car. So then he gives this car to me, and I was working at a gas station at the time, which was not the one that put the STP in there. It's a different one. I mean, but I went ahead and took that engine down. Had to tear it all the way down. It was an in-frame deal, you know, because you could get the pan and the heads and the manifold off pretty easy on old cars like that without having to do a whole lot. And I pulled all of the pistons and cylinders, you know, piston and connecting rods out, and I carried it up to the machine shop, and I let Cliff, the guy at the machine shop, you know, press the pistons off and back on, lubricate them and all that, and got them where they would flop around real easy. And then I put rings and bearings and gaskets and all that kind of stuff on there. And one of the holes, and I got to say, I was young, I was, you know, probably 18, 19 years old at the time. When I put it all back together, one of the holes had some fluid of some kind down in the bottom of it. It was oil or water or something. And one of the cylinder head bolts didn't torque tight enough against the cylinder head, and it blew a gasket to the outside when I was driving it home the first night after I built it. So the next day I had to put it back in there and pull that head off, blow out that hole and all the other holes, and then put the, you know, torque everything back down. And I drove that car for a pretty good while after that. Now it kind of sucked the gas. The speedometer was upside down on it. Well, and the rear power windows didn't work, but the front ones did. And so me and these three guys, there was one guy sitting in the front with me and two guys in the back. And a lot of these guys I grew up with chewed tobacco. And so the guy in the back, the guy in the front says, I need a can to spit in, because he kept rolling my window down. It was in January, rolling my window down, spitting and roll it back up. I said, quit spitting out the window. You're getting it on the side of the car. Don't you're rolling the window up and down too much. And he said, well, I don't have anything to spit in. And so, you know, rather than telling him to quit chewing tobacco, which would have been a cardinal sin, you know, I didn't chew tobacco, but a lot of my friends did. I says, let's go ahead and get you a can. So he handed me a can. I handed him a can, and he said, I don't have my pocket knife, which was kind of wacky because everybody always carried their pocket knife. So I handed him my knife, and he cut the top out of the can so he'd have something to spit in. Well, the guy in the back seat started wanting to, he was having to open the door to spit. He wanted me to cut the top out of a can for him, and I said, I'm not using my knife to cut the top out of another can. You got your buck knife on your belt back there. And so basically there was a big fuss that went on about that, because I wasn't going to cut the top, let my knife be used to cut the top out of another can. So we were driving, and so the guy in the back was in the National Guard, so he could go by the post exchange, and he bought this little buck honing oil kit. And it had 2 honing rocks and a little can of buck honing oil in that kit. I think it was $2.45 at the time you bought. This was in the 70s. And so the guy in the front seat was spitting in his can, and the guy in the back seat kept saying, loan me your can so I can spit in it. And he wouldn't loan him his can. So the guy in the back seat, you know, the little tip that you're supposed to cut off the top of the honing oil spout so you can get honing oil out of there, he had bit that off of there. I don't know why he didn't use his knife. And so he thumped it on this guy's sleeve up here. And then the guy up here got a little piece of tobacco and flipped it back there on the other guy's suede jacket. And so the other guy, this was the dumbest thing I've ever seen anybody do. The guy that was sitting in the back took the buck honing oil and squirted it into the guy's ear in the front. So the guy in the front took his can of tobacco spit and threw it all over the guy's suede jacket. This is a retaliation story, right? Oh, it was terrible. But one way or another, there was a big hullabaloo that went on because of that. All I was doing was driving the car. I didn't drink. A lot of my other friends did. They weren't drinking that afternoon, but I was usually the designated driver because I didn't drink and everybody else did. And I probably saved a lot of lives back then. Another thing that happened was when I was on this same Chrysler on my way to Texas, I drove along out here on this long straight highway in this Pontiac, brand spanking new Pontiac Grand Prix. I was running about 60 and he'd pass me and slow down to 55. And so I would pass him, and he'd pass me again. He'd slow down to 55. And about the third or fourth time that happened, I was on a long straight road. It wasn't an interstate back then. It was just a 2-lane blacktop, but it was in Mississippi. You could see this as far as you wanted to. No other cars around. I don't know why. It was in the middle of the day. And so the next time this guy started trying to pass me, I just kept giving that old Chrysler its head, and the speedometer was upside down, and it slammed out of sight up past 120, and that Grand Prix ran out of steam about 100 miles an hour, and he just started falling back because that's all he had. He didn't have over 100 miles an hour, and that Chrysler would cruise. Anyway, he never tried to pass me again because he was humiliated. But I drove that car for a while and finally sold it to my aunt, so anyway, and she drove it for a while, and then she sold it to somebody else. Now this right here is an interesting story on a Mustang. This Mustang kept throwing misfire codes. I think it was on cylinder number 2. And the guy that was working on it was fighting with it. He noticed that whenever he used the IDS to get the power balance, he would get 40 RPM less on the cylinder that was throwing that. So they pulled a compression test, and it had 40 pounds less compression than any of the other cylinders, on the average. And so then they pulled the head off of it, and they found this bent rod. The reason when they pulled the head off and they barred the engine through, and that piston stopped a quarter of an inch lower than all the rest of them because the rod was bent. That was probably because of a hydraulic lock where the engine drank some water. Then a hydraulic locked that one cylinder, because none of the rest of them were like that, just that one. And it wasn't running rough or anything. You couldn't even tell it had a misfire. If it hadn't had misfire detection with all this OBD2 stuff, they probably never would have known it. But that's an actual picture of that piston and the way that rod was bent and everything. I just wanted to share that little piece. Now, there was this one motorhome job. I was actually working on this Ranger that was beating me up because I couldn't get it to, it had a wave coming out of the crank sensor, but it wouldn't, and that was one of those ones that had the little EDIS module, and it wouldn't fire on the coil for anything, but it had a signal when I checked it with my scope. Getting over there, and I'm thinking, what the deal is with this? Everything else was like it ought to be. And so this guy comes walking up with the shop foreman, and he says, I parked my motorhome about 3 weeks ago, and it was running just fine, and now it won't start, and I don't know what to do. And I said, well, let's go out here and have a look at it. You probably got ants in your relays. These relays here, in the bottom of it, there was a little square hole. I don't know why that square hole was in the bottom of some of those Ford relays, but it was. And ants would climb up in there, and they would get between the contacts like you see on this one right here. This wasn't actually the relay from that truck, but what I found out when I went out there and switched on that motorhome, there was no fuel pump activity. I went ahead and took the relay, and I fell to the relay, and it tried to click a little bit. When I popped the cover off of it, there was one little ant that had got up in there and got between those points, and the first time they tried to close it, crushed that ant and didn't get a connection in the fuel plug. It took a little tiny ant that stopped a 10,000-pound motorhome from going anywhere. And I popped another relay in there. I was patting myself on the back. Then I get back to the shop, and I've got this Ranger looking at me. That's the one I know I told about that in a previous video where I actually ran an overlay between the EDIS module and the crank sensor, twisted some wires, put a foil shield on them and all that. And whenever I ran an overlay, I don't know why the wires that were going, they weren't compromised or cut or scraping on anything. But what I did was just replace the wire between the crank sensor. Now I will tell you this, if you ever replace the crank sensor wires on any of these Fords and you transpose those two wires going to that crank sensor, that vehicle will not start. And if you're watching your scan tool, if you've got them transposed like pins 21 and 22 on a 104 pin processor, if you swap those pins around, it will actually start counting RPM when you spin it, and then it'll drop to 0 because it will detect it. That's an inverted signal. And so I used to use that for a no-start bug when I first started teaching, and I had that 98 Ranger where I'd swap those two pins around, and it wouldn't fire for anything. And if somebody wasn't paying attention to which pin went where, and that the blue pin went here, the blue wire went here and the gray one went there, and you had to really be at the top of your game and paying attention to what was going on. You put those things in the wrong. Another thing you do is move a wire to a cavity that was ordinarily empty so that it wasn't even touching anything that mattered and all that. Anyway, but the ants, and I saw ants one time pile up on top of a battery like a quarter of an inch deep all the way from one terminal to the other. and I guess those ants' little wires got crossed, and they just kept piling on until it was, the battery was dead. It was on a Thunderbird when it came in there, and when I opened the hood, it had a pile of ants about 1/4 inch thick stretching from one post to the other, and it was enough drain to kill the battery. This right here, we use this Ingersoll Rand 90-degree impact wrench, which was like $350 when I bought it, to snatch those spark plugs out of these 5.4s. Now, we had taken some spark plugs out trying to do it gently and slowly, and that rolls the little crimp back and leaves that part down in there, and then you got to get the tool, pull it out, and it's just a pain all the way around, you know. But one of the things I found out was that we didn't even have to heat the motor up. And you do this however works for you. You know, don't try to act like I told you to do something. But what I will tell you is every time we use this impact wrench on those spark plugs, you know, with that 9/16 socket, we would snatch those plugs out. Every one of them would come out without leaving a single one behind. And we did that on several of these. And so that was the way that we did it. Now, I can't really say that I'm the one that came up with this method. There was another shop, the shop that dealt with the parts house I bought parts from when I was at the college, and he said that they would always jerk those spark plugs out with an impact wrench. Because if you think about it, you got nothing to lose anyway. If they're going to come apart, they're going to come apart. But I've never heard of them leaving the nose in there if you jerk them out with an impact wrench. So just take that for what it's worth, but do what you know is safe, and make sure that you take responsibility for the method you choose. I'm just telling you what worked for us. This one here was an RE401 automatic transmission out of a Nissan. And that little ball is supposed to roll back and forth between those two holes. And one of my students, when he was cleaning the valve body, well, the problem was that one had wiped out the splines in the torque converter. And we went ahead and put a torque converter and cleaned everything out, but there was enough metal filings in the dadgum radiator from the wiped out torque converter that it kept getting metal filings in the valve body, and they had to clean the valve body 5 or 6 times. And typically what I always taught my students after that was, if you've got one that's got the splines wiped out in the torque converter, you better blow those lines out good and put another radiator on there, or put an external cooler one. Anyway, when they were rebuilding it, they took that valve body apart and cleaned it and put it back together about 4 or 5 times. And one time they were in such a hurry, they put a ball here and a ball there. They had a ball in both places instead of just the one that was supposed to roll back and forth. You know, it's kind of comical. When that thing shifted to second gear, it locked up the wheels. Anyway, we had to tear the valve body back down, and that's what we found, was they put a ball here and a ball there. And that was just a little funny story there. This is the Cobra that you saw me driving in that other video that I published a while back. This Cobra was built from a kit, and the dealer principal at the dealer where I was working bought a 351, 5.8 if you will. That was a motorsport engine that had like 350 or 60 horsepower or something like that. And we built that thing, and boy, that thing drove like a go-kart. Anywhere you pointed it, that's where it went. And when you took off shifting like you normally would, that thing would be going 80 miles an hour by the time you had counted to 7. I mean, this thing would absolutely fly. It was downright scary, you know, for a youngster driving it. It was more or less of a death trap, I imagine, because you'd wrap it around a phone pole before you knew it. But boy, that was a sweet ride. And he eventually sold it. I don't know who he sold it to or what he sold it for. But he had this car, he had a GT40 that we built, and he also had a DeLorean that he had traded a pickup for, all in the showroom at the same time, and they were really good conversation pieces, you know. But all of those, my buddy that lives out there, you know, that runs his own shop out there between here and the big town up the road, he actually owns the DeLorean now, and his wife still drives it sometimes. But ironically, the speedometer on that DeLorean only reads 80 miles an hour, so he can't even make it to 88, so there will be no time travel for him. That and the fact that he doesn't have a flux capacitor on him, even though if you look up on AutoZone's website, there is a flux capacitor they list on there, but they don't have one in stock usually. All right, let me see here. This right here was a Chevy and a Ford in the same shop at the same time, facing each other, both lifted up on lifts. And I had seen this at the college over there. This was actually a dealership. Believe it or not, it was at a Nissan dealership, and they had these 2 American trucks up. If you notice, this Chevrolet truck is sagging. Every time we jacked up a truck of this general vintage, the frame was limber enough to where it would let the truck sag. It would have more space up here than it would have down here at the bottom, and the back would sag. The Ford would never do that. The Ford would always hold its shape really good and straight. Now, you know, granted, I drive a Ford pickup and all that, and I don't have an axe to grind against Chevrolets. But as far as the body and all, back in these days, the body on a Chevy was not nearly as solid as the body on a Ford. There's a guy that I know that owns a tire store. He raised a Chevrolet like this one up that had a bunch of stuff in the back of it, heavy stuff in the back. He put it up on a lift, and the frame broke in half. And his shop insurance had to pay for the frame to be replaced under that vehicle because the frame was so weak. You know, of course, that guy, it just underscored what he already believed, because he never liked Chevys anyway. I don't have anything against Chevys or GMs or all that. Just about any vehicle you look after the way you're supposed to. If you follow the owner's manual and you do what they tell you to, just about any car you buy will probably get you to where you want to go without breaking down very much. You know, I had a little Nissan though that I inherited from my wife when I bought her first, you know, the new car right as we got married back in '93. And she had an '87 Sentra, and I really followed it had 50,000 on it when I started driving it. In real good shape, sweet little car. I enjoyed driving it, but it had a little carburetor in it. And that thing put me down beside the road more than any car I ever drove. I mean, the carburetor, the little screen up inside the carburetor that you don't even know is there, clogged up when I was on the trip to Savannah. And, you know, I had to figure out what was going on there. It was aggravating as all get out. Secondly, the fuel pump died on it, and it would crank up and go about 150 yards when it was hot, and then die, and then you spin, and finally it'd start up and it'd drive okay. We used to see that on Escorts too. And I don't remember what else went wrong. There's 2 or 3 different things, but it put me down beside the road more than any other car I ever had, and I was careful to maintain that thing just like the manufacturer said. How many of you ever used one of these things? This is a battery terminal puller from a Snap-on, you know, battery terminal service kit. This is not anything I've ever needed, but when I went to the college, one of these was in the college toolbox. I thought it was pretty cool. I kept it in my desk drawer. You know, if you ever had a battery terminal that's really boneheaded and hard to get off, you could use this little puller, snatch it off of there. Some of you guys may even have one of these in your toolbox. All right, so this right here was Mom's 73 Imperial, and that was my 69 LTD. And this little dog, this dog's name was Spot. Now, Mama took in a lot of stray dogs, and she would feed just any dog that came into the yard. And this dog right here was really friendly to every other. At the time, for a while, he was the only dog we had. There were other times we'd have 6 or 7 dogs. Sometimes we'd have 1 or 2. Well, this dog was the only one we had for a while. And when a new dog came around, he would be real friendly with the dog and make friends with him. And then he would lead him off down into the swamp. And they would both come back with little swamp water all over them, because we had swamp behind the house back there. And so this dog would keep taking dog number 2, whichever dog it was, and he did this to 2 or 3 different dogs. He'd take him down into the swamp and come back alone one day, and you'd never see that other dog again. And I'm assuming he was taking the dog down there and getting it snake bit. But he got some, you know, he got rid of 2 or 3 dogs because he liked being the only dog. Well, the strange thing about this dog was, one day I went out there, and this dog had just fell over dead. He was a young dog, probably 4 or 5 years old, and he just died. He just flat died. Out of the blue. I don't know what the deal was. I had to bury him, but I mean, nobody killed him, you know, except he may have had to, you know, he may have paid the price for having murdered other dogs by leading them into a snake pit or whatever. I don't know what happened down there. This is me wearing this JB hat. Some of you guys might remember Justice Brothers products. When I was working at the gas station a long time ago in the 70s, some of the products that we had, and I don't remember the name of it, these little cans of red oil that you would pour in there that was supposed to make the engine oil better, would have money rattling around in the can. And so whenever you would use that additive, you know, like if you sold a can of that additive, the customer would pay for it. You'd pour it in there, and then you would get to keep the can, and you would cut the can open, and it'd be a quarter or 2 in there, or maybe a quarter and a nickel and a dime or something like that. And every can had money in it. Well, Justice Brothers didn't want to go to the trouble to put money in there, so they put these little round red washer things with a hole in the middle of them, and had their logo on them. And so for every one of those that you had in your toolbox, when the Justice Brothers man came back, he would give you 25 cents. Okay? How about that? So here you'd wind up with, sometimes you'd have like a whole big stack of them things, which, you know, every 4 of them was $1, and you could get enough money to buy lunch for a couple of days, you know, if you use a lot of that Justice Brothers stuff. Anyway, but that's me back in 1978 I was on a trip to the Grand Canyon, I think, or something like that. But anyway, that's about all I got for you today. And I really appreciate you guys stopping by and listening to all my stories. My wife gets bored listening to my stories, but I know some of you guys like them. I don't know, some of y'all might get bored with them too. But I really appreciate your time, and I hope you've enjoyed the stories today. And I'll have some more stuff for you to sink your teeth into next time. Talk to you later.